and hello to everybody there. I'm in my study at home in London, where it's a rather cool autumnal data, but fortunately for me as a cricket tragic, the cricket season hasn't quite ended yet, so I'm probably going to be at cricket tomorrow, rugged up against the cold just before the whole thing ends. I'm going to share the screen now. And we'll go to the beginning.
Yes.
So I hope you can all see that.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. I guess many researchers like yourselves try to define their research topics in terms of a practical contribution you hope to make. For instance, you might say that your research is going to show better ways in which people can communicate, or how organizations can function more effectively. Now, in light of this, my central message in this talk is a sort of paradox. I believe, and my experience suggests, that you can contribute most to society by avoiding defining your research topics at the outset in terms of such social or managerial problems. Now, this doesn't mean that at the start you shouldn't try and find out what stakeholders want from your research. But my experience suggests that it's best to discover what you can offer them at the conclusion of your research, when you know more about what it is you're studying. This has certainly been true of all my ethnographic research on different kinds of public sector organizations, going back to the 1970s when I was studying the Greater London Council and how it recruited and promoted staff, into the 80s when I was studying a series of pediatric clinics, in the 90s when I was studying HIV test counseling and how it operated, and quite recently when I was involved in a Danish project on a shelter for homeless people, and how decisions got made with these homeless people about where they should be moved to more permanent accommodation. Now, I'm going to talk for under an hour, and then, as Susan said, I'm going to invite your questions. Why does any of this matter? Let's think about that. Why is it difficult to do what I suggest? Why, following that paradox of not beginning from a practical problem? One of the reasons why it's difficult to begin that way is that anybody who's filled in a research proposal recently for funding will tend to find on the application form a word like outputs, that funders seem to want you to define at the outset what you're going to be able to, what your research is going to contribute to various stakeholders. But how do you know in a lot of qualitative research? When I studied my pediatric clinics, for instance, I didn't know what I was going to find and how it might be relevant to the participants, and I'll get back to that. But also, most funding applications are not set up in the kind of inductive way in which I, along with a lot of qualitative researchers, work. So they expect you to have variables. They expect you to have hypotheses before you enter the field. And very often, because I, like many of you, no doubt, I work inductively, I try and induce those hypotheses out of my data. Another reason why it matters and why it's difficult to do research in the kind of way I'm suggesting is often because of access problems, you're researching your own organization or profession. And while this is a gain, potentially, because you know a lot of things, often the things you know, you may be based upon taken for granted knowledge of how the setting works. One of the beauties of qualitative research is that it makes those ordinary features problematic, and a way of looking at it is to say we try and make the ordinary extraordinary. We show that obvious and taken for granted features of how we interact with one another are actually much more complicated. I expand on this in my very short book.
No.
I heard a noise from somewhere, but can you make sure you've turned your mics off? And a third reason why all this matters and is difficult is that often we're guests inside organizations, or we're guests in the sense of getting access to people to study in interviews and focus groups. And to get access, we have to offer something in return. We have to take account of what our hosts want. But it's important not to let that determine what you look for. And I'll come back to that in a minute. A fourth reason why this matters and why it's difficult is that if we're doing qualitative research, we're doing it in the context of a society, which is a society where numbers talk. If you think of the virus at the moment, how it's defined is often in terms of the number of people vaccinated, the number of infections, and the number, sadly, of deaths. Numbers talk. So how do we convince others that our research is credible when we don't have too many numbers? Another problem that we face. And then there are ethical issues in doing research, which is supposed to have some kind of practical output. Recently, one of the students, an Australian student in one of my workshops, was doing research on women in welfare with autistic children. These people who were barely coping economically and also were trying to manage their children with autism. And she proposed to interview these women. Well, I discussed this with her and I said, well, in some sense, you're using these women as a way to get your PhD. What can you offer them in return? And we discussed another way of doing her research, which might offer them something much more practical in terms of her to these women. And also, I think, make the research more interesting. Instead of asking questions of these women, we discussed a research design where she spent time in their household, discovering what the ordinary day was like. And very often, going back to what I said about making the ordinary extraordinary, people aren't aware of these kinds of things, and you won't see these kinds of things by asking people predefined questions. You have to be there to see what it's like. Of course, this is difficult in terms of COVID. I'll come back to that in a moment. So this could have an ethical gain as well, not only a research gain. She could actually perhaps be of use to these women. For instance, she might mind the children while the mother went shopping. However, all of these issues occur in the context of COVID, and COVID has severely limited the kind of ethnographic research that I and maybe some of you like to do. I've written a brief paper on this for the journal Communication and Medicine, and if anybody would like to read it, it's just come out. Susan has a copy, and she's kindly offered to forward it to you. So do contact Susan if you'd like to see my thoughts on this complicated situation we now find ourselves in if we want to do many kinds of qualitative research. Now, before I enlarge on the paradox with which I began and the difficulties associated with following the direction I'm suggesting, I want to mention a bit of history. And this will take us back to the 1950s. And the reason I'm taking you back there is an important study that was done, which has largely been ignored since. At that time, the American sociologist Peter Blau managed to get access to an employment agency. And this agency obviously was trying to place people in jobs. And the management, while Blau was in that agency, had the bright idea of trying to see how effective each worker in the agency was. And what they tried to do in order to measure that efficiency was to count the number of job placements each agent managed to achieve. Certain problems arose that Blau observed when this new measurement scheme came into place. People working in the agency now realized their jobs were on the line unless they had lots of job placements. So what did they do? they did things like suggesting to clients that unless they took a particular job that they were offering to them, they might have sanctions against them, even though there was no basis for this. So this goal of achieving greater efficiency had an unintended consequence. In fact, it wasn't a goal, it was a means to an end of making the organization more efficient. But actually the means became more important than the end that it was supposed to achieve. Moreover, Blau also observed that some of these agents actually stole files. We're back to the 50s. They had physical files, then nothing was online, stole files off other agents' desks in order to have more people that they were working on in order to increase their job placements. So here is a classical study from 70 years ago with all kinds of practical imports about the issue of metrics. Yet despite Blau's study, we see how metrics come to dominate so many organizations. For instance, in universities, people now are promoted in terms of publications and also in terms of citations. And it's citations I feel quite strongly about, because I find myself cited regularly in a way that's inappropriate to what I've actually suggested. So people doing the opposite of what I suggest in my books put my name after what I think is the wrong turning they've taken. I think what's going on is that actually, because in the desire to publish lots of things, people don't read so much literature. They think they need to have a literature list. So they just Google a topic, see who's written on it, and they actually don't know whether they're for or against whatever technique that they've Googled. Well, this contributes to making me an angry old man. But you see the unintended consequences of metrics. An even clearer example of this was seen in the British National Health Service a few years ago, when the government had a bright idea of saying that nobody should wait longer. I think it was 4 hours, longer than 4 hours, hell of a long time, if they went to accident and emergency unit at a hospital, if they went to a casualty department at a hospital. It was subsequently discovered that this new metric had all kinds of unintended consequences. Hospitals didn't want to be defined as going against the metric. So what did they do? Where during busy periods, ambulance drivers were instructed not to bring patients into the hospital, but to park up in the parking area outside the hospital till things got less busy, and then they could bring their patients in. Well, you can see how this might have nasty consequences for the health of the patients. And it also meant, of course, the ambulance, because they still had the patients in them, couldn't deposit them and go off and get more patients. So here we have a displacement of goals yet again. Through putting in a means supposedly to achieve the goal, a metric, it has quite unintended consequences. Blau pointed this out 70 years ago, but are universities or health services paying any attention to it? In my experience, not. Now, in the rest of what I want to say, I'm going to be talking about why organizations and governments resist what qualitative research can offer. And then I'm going to suggest some solutions to how we can have a practical input. So let me begin with why they resist qualitative research. I already suggested something along those lines in terms of numbers talking. Let me explain that a bit more in terms of a particular orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy I have in mind here, I've called, and this is again drawn from my very short book, the explanatory orthodoxy. Funding agencies expect research to be looking at the causes and consequences of phenomena. They think they know what the phenomenon is, and they want to know what causes it and what its consequences are, so it can be made, the situation can be made more effective. Now, of course, qualitative research, as many of you who do it will know, is not very strong on finding the causes of something. or its consequences, it has very small samples compared to quantitative research. It doesn't do the kind of statistical correlations that we find in quantitative research. And if numbers talk, qualitative research is very weak. So one of the orthodoxies we're fighting against is the explanatory orthodoxy. And it leaves open the question, if we're not trying to explain, what are we trying to do? And I think I've already implied it, because if we just look at the causes and consequences of a phenomenon, this assumes we know what the phenomenon is. And that's where quant research is weak, and where organizations are weak, because they assume they know what the phenomenon is without the kind of close knowledge that qualitative research can give. There's another orthodoxy that we have to fight against, and I'm going to call this the divine orthodoxy. The divine orthodoxy assumes that researchers think they know better about how the world works than participants do. And so that what we're going to do when we study a situation is to show how the participants are failing in various ways. And we're going to show them how they're mistaken and can do better. How do we fight this orthodoxy? Well, the way I fight it is telling organizations that might give me access that rather than criticize the kind of work they do or find faults in what they do, I'm going to show unnoticed skills that the participants are using, that they're doing things that they're unaware of, that they've never been trained in, which often, not always, but often actually contribute to the goals of the organization. So I try and avoid being in a situation where I'm looking for failures, and instead I'm looking for unnoticed skills. Let me give you an example of the kind of thing I mean. I mentioned that in the 90s, I was doing research on HIV test counseling. And naturally, I wanted to offer some feedback to the counselors I was studying. And at one such feedback session, I had all my slides ready. And I'd worked out the implications of possible implications of my research for their practice. I didn't get that far to talk about implications. What I did at the start was to put up detailed transcripts based upon recordings of what HIV test counseling actually looked like between the counselor and the counseled person, where you could see the overlaps and the pauses and the hesitations. And at that stage, the counselors got very excited. They looked at these transcripts, which showed what they did and others did in greater detail than they were unaware of. And they started to say things like, oh, I see. So if the counselor gives advice in this kind of way, this is how the client tends to respond. And then they talked about their practice. And to me, this was a beautiful vision of what qualitative research can offer in terms of social impact. We provide the resources which the participants can use to improve their own practice, where they know what they're trying to achieve better than I do. So we give them the resource by showing them in great detail the nature of what it is they're doing based upon detailed transcriptions of their work. There's a further problem. Before I get on to solutions, more solutions, there's a further problem which we face when we're doing qualitative research, which we want to have social impact. Very often, and I've touched upon this already, in the explanatory orthodoxy, we're competing with quantitative researchers, and there are certain ways of competing with quantitative researchers that make us bound to lose. In many of my books and articles, I reflect upon what I call the dominance of manufactured data in qualitative research, the way in which so much qualitative research, up to about 90% if you look at many journals, is based not upon studying what actually happens in situ, but is based upon interviews, focus groups, which wouldn't happen unless the researcher set them up. That's why I call it manufactured data. Why are we competing with the quants when we use these kinds of manufactured data? Because the quants use manufactured data themselves and can use it with much larger samples than we can and pre-tested questions. So if we just think of qualitative research in terms of manufactured data rather than naturalistic data, we're competing with the quants. Secondly, and this is a focus, this is a feature of the kind of research design which is expected of us when we apply for funding. Many of us have at the outset to set up a research protocol and believe that we have to stick rigidly to it, like the quantitative researchers do. By contrast, I'd argue, in good qualitative research, we work inductively, we discover our topics and our hypotheses in the course of analyzing what we've discovered in the field. And very often, the best qualitative research, both I think that I've done and my PhD students have done, is the most different, often becomes the most different from what they intended at the start. Now, this is quite the opposite of quantitative research, where if you think of the randomized control trial, which is the gold standard in medical research, you have to stick rigidly to the protocol, otherwise it's of no value. By contrast, in qualitative research, changing what you do in the light of the findings that you've induced often leads to far better, more revealing research. Another way in which we compete with the quants is that we delay our data analysis. So many, and this is particularly true of PhD students, who spend often their first year just reading books and doing literature reviews instead of collecting and analyzing data. In my book, Doing Qualitative Research, I talk about data analysis on day one. And it's crucial to get into early data analysis in qualitative research, because, as I say, we work inductively and we're finding out our research design in the course of our data analysis. You might say, how can I do data analysis on day one if I haven't got any data yet? Well, if you work with documents or you work with digital data, you do have very often your data on day one. But even if you don't, work with other people's data, try and analyze it, and work out a good way that you can use on your own data when you have it. There's a fourth way in which we compete with the quants, in that so often what we're doing is topicalizing how people see the world, their perceptions. By contrast, quantitative researchers have big data they can work with very often, or they have surveys, and they have, it seems to me, much stronger data to analyze how people see the world very often than we do. And this argument that some qualitative researchers use, that we're better understanding how people see the world because we're more empathetic and we can go into depth in perceptions, seems to me a line that's more appropriate to the side professions than it is to good qualitative research. Finally, it seems to me in a lot of qualitative research, we go wrong by making tacit claims about populations. We can't make claims about how different population groups see the world, given the small samples that we can use. Where do the tacit claims come up? They come up, it seems to me, when one looks at how, say, interview data is often presented, where after a data extract, we have in brackets certain kinds of features of the person who said whatever we've said they said. We put their age or their gender and so on. We're making a tacit claim there, aren't we, about how age or gender influence the kind of thing that they say. And we can't really seriously make those kinds of claims on the basis of the samples that we operate with. And what's important, it seems to me, if you're working with interview data, is not the identity we ascribe to the participants, it's rather the identities they move between in their talk. So rather than sort of this sleight of hand of allocating them certain kinds of identities, rather we should be making our research topic the identity work of the participants. Now, given all these problems, why should funders and the people we study think qualitative research is credible and relevant to their practical needs? We're asking for trouble, it seems to me, the more we compete with quantitative researchers. Let me try and explain that a bit more, coming back to the issue of perceptions, it seems to me in a lot of qualitative research, there's a black box. I put the phenomenon there as the black box in square brackets. So much qualitative research looks at how people perceive some phenomenon or how they respond to some phenomenon. But the phenomenon itself is a black box. What is it? What we tend to do in qualitative research is use our common sense knowledge of some kind of phenomenon out there in the world, and then based upon that, we ask how people are responding to it or perceiving it. But what is the phenomenon? How does the phenomenon actually get put together in real life, not based upon our everyday knowledge, but in real time? The beauty of qualitative research is that it can, unlike so many kinds of quantitative research, it can actually discover the phenomenon in real time. Let me give you an example of that from my work on HIV test counseling. The phenomenon I discovered was that in the course of this, in course of pre-test counseling, patients were given various kinds of health promotion advice about how they could protect themselves against HIV. This was back in the 1990s. And I noticed something curious about this, that the advice very often would get nil response. So the patient would either say nothing after they'd been given a piece of advice, or at best say, mm-hmm. They didn't have any questions about what the advice meant. They didn't show it that it was of any relevance to them. Now, this made me curious, because if you think about your own lives, if somebody, say a friend or relative, asks you for a piece of advice, it's an awkward situation. And if you hear what their problem is and you give a piece of advice and you get nil response, you're in trouble, because there's an indication that the advice is not meaningful to the person who's asked for it. Yet, in the setting I was studying in HIV test counseling, the counselors didn't seem troubled by this. They went on to talk about other kinds of issues related to HIV and the test, the antibody test that the patient was about to have. How could this happen? And then I discovered a phenomenon. I discovered that the way in which the counselors sheltered themselves from lack of uptake of advice was to deliver the advice in a particular kind of format, an unusual format. Rather than say, now, John, this is what I suggest you do in future, they said, in the clinic, the kind of advice we give is to do X. Now, what was interesting to me about this was that it's not at all clear this is an advice format at all. Rather, it's hearable as information about the advice we give in this clinic. And information doesn't need the kind of solid uptake in everyday life that advice does. So the nurses who were giving this advice managed the situation where they knew that they were going to get very little uptake, because they didn't have time to discover what the patients were worried about. They had about 10 minutes to get through it all. And they managed it beautifully by using something that I called an advice as information sequence. They hadn't been trained to do this, but they did it in order to get through. They were using skills they were unaware of. And I've argued that this kind of data found in my recordings and in transcripts will be very useful in training. So people entering the field could find out how things actually worked, rather than just based upon rote learning of do's and don'ts. I mentioned earlier, and you must all be aware of how this has affected your research, of the way in which COVID is limiting the kind of research we can often do, particularly the kind of ethnographic research that I like to do. If we think about pandemics more generally, what is the role of qualitative research in pandemics? Let's go back a few years, and I'm referring to work by the anthropologist Gillian Tett, who now writes for the Financial Times. you'll see her name at the end of this slide. She did in about 2013, 2014. She was interested in the spread of Ebola in West Africa, another pandemic. Now, according to the quant people, one neat way of tracing how an infected person was moving and who he or she was coming into contact with would be to get the details of their smartphones, find their location, and you would know how that person was moving around. However, what Tet discovered, predictably, if you start to think about it, was that, at least at that time, smartphones were very expensive to people. And so in West Africa, they were generally shared among people. They didn't just, weren't always present with a particular person. So she showed that this data actually didn't tell what it was supposed to tell. The quantitative data didn't tell you the location of the affected person. They told you about the location of whoever they passed their phone on to. And so you had no idea, no way of testing the spread or locating the spread of Ebola, but through the smartphone. Because she was also present as an anthropologist at many of the relevant settings, she also discovered some local customs that also were relevant to the spread of Ebola. She attended funerals in West Africa, and she discovered that for many groups, it was expected that at a funeral, you actually it was appropriate and necessary to touch the body of the deceased person before they were buried. Now, this could be an important vector of transmission of Ebola. And you wouldn't know this through numbers. She discovered a phenomenon. The same might well apply to resistance to vaccination of COVID. Is it just about wrong information, or do we need to know much more about how people seek information and what groups they belong to, particularly in a digital age? Overall, what Tet suggests, and these are her own words, that while quantitative research can offer a bird's eye view looking down about how the world works, the beauty of qualitative research is that it offers us a worm's eye view of how things actually work in situ. And this is the contribution, potential contribution of qualitative research. Gillian has written a book on anthropology, which I haven't got round to yet, but I'm going to read very soon, setting out these ideas and others. But you can also find her writing in the Saturday edition of the Financial Times. Let me give you some other examples of how qualitative research can have a social impact. What you see in that picture is somebody in a wheelchair being loaded onto a bus. Some years ago, an American sociologist called Ross Koppel got interested in how handicapped and disabled people were using the Boston buses. And it all started because he'd hailed a bus in Boston where he was living at the time, and next to him was somebody in a wheelchair, and he noticed as the bus, you could hardly miss it, as the bus came up to take him, it speeded up and didn't stop. Why on earth might this be going on? Was it just a nasty driver? And Koppel explored this some more and discovered that actually there was a metric behind this. Bus drivers needed to keep to a timetable. They couldn't take too long. And at that time, given the design of Boston buses, it took a long time to load somebody in a wheelchair onto the bus. So he did more systematic research. He arranged for a wheelchair user to be with him at a bus stop. And so you had a wheelchair user, an observer at the bus stops, and he videoed what happened. So he documented the kinds of things that were happening. And you couldn't argue with his findings. As a result of those findings, a lot of money had to be spent by the Boston bus system on redesigning buses so that these problems of delay didn't happen. So here we have a situation where you actually, once again, discover what the phenomenon was like. Some further examples. And I'm giving you these examples because, as I've just been arguing, it seems to me the main contribution of qualitative research is to give access to phenomena in situ. And without it, change based on correlations will have unknown consequences. Some years ago, my colleague at King's College Business School, Christian Heath, did some research on London Underground traffic control systems. And he had some videos of what is called a traffic control room, where groups of workers were looking at the movement of underground trains through the system, and they had access to video material of where the train was in a station. They also had access to their colleagues around them in their office, and they could also ring up or contact online other colleagues. And what he was interested in is how decision was made on a minute by minute basis to, for instance, delay a train in a station in order to minimize the gaps between trains on the network. He discovered a phenomenon. He discovered how this worked on a day-to-day, on a minute-by-minute or second-by-second basis, but through detailed transcriptions of these videos. A couple more examples. And this is a much older example from the American sociologist David Sudnow, and it relates to legal systems. Sudnow was looking at the US criminal law system, and what he was concerned with was how it came to pass that so many defendants pleaded guilty. It turns out, law is not my area, but as I found out, that most legal systems wouldn't work unless most defendants pleaded guilty. The reason being that if you plead guilty, the hearing is much shorter, and so you can get many more defendants through. What Sudnow became fascinated by was the negotiation between the defending lawyer and the prosecuting lawyer about how a charge could be reduced to get the person to plead guilty, but at the same time, the prosecuting lawyer wouldn't want to reduce it so much that it made a serious offense trivial. And commonsensically, what he showed both lawyers were operating with was an assumption about something that he called normal crimes. That were there any aggravating features in this particular case would mean you couldn't reduce a charge, say from manslaughter to grievous bodily harm and so on. And he looked at actually the details of those negotiations. A final example that I want to mention is a wonderful study done by Lindsay Pryor in Northern Ireland, looking at how mortality statistics actually come to be. How would you do that? Well, he managed to get access to an office where Northern Irish civil servants were in receipt of death certificates. And what he looked at is the process through which these death certificates were transformed by these workers into a statistic which would then become part of the mortality statistics for Northern Ireland. And death certificates have usually space for the doctor to write potentially multiple causes of death. And what he noticed was the way in which these civil servants were actually making ad hoc decisions about which of these causes of death they could enter into the official statistics, given that only one cause of death could be put there. Sometimes they put the top number one, or sometimes they put the number 3 cause of death. So what you find is that mortality statistics are a social construction. Now, I gave a talk about the application of qualitative research to a group of demographers who use mortality statistics every day. And they're not dopes. They realize that there might be errors in these mortality statistics, they might be biased. They couldn't get access to the phenomenon in doing quantitative research. Only qualitative researchers could discover how, on a minute-by-minute basis, these statistics actually got assembled out of the raw material of death certificates. So we find the very rich, these are examples of a very rich way in which qualitative research can get access to phenomena that are very relevant for practice. In all of this, we can't ignore practitioners' problems. We must attend to host concerns. We always need to give feedback, but we must be wary of managerial versions of problems, which so often assume that the problems arise because of a problem of communication. If we have what Blau refers to as a displacement of goals, that's hardly a communication problem. So in my research, as I've been arguing, it's important initially to avoid the host problems and have an openness to unexpected things that we're going to discover when we look at our data. So a good motto for qualitative research is to expect the unexpected. And I'm coming towards the end now. I'll stop in a bit, no more than 15 minutes. Let me give you some examples of expecting the unexpected from my own research. In the 80s, I was studying a London children's heart unit, a pediatric cardiology unit. And like in all my research, it was based upon recordings of what happened in consultations, in this case, between doctors and parents. The children were often very small and their only contribution was to cry occasionally in this kind of setting. So I was looking at how the doctor talked to the parents and how the parents talked back to the doctor. And after a while, I had gathered about 100 consultations, and I thought I'd worked out what I call the ceremonial order of the clinic, how the doctor would take what doctors call a history initially, how he would then examine the child, and then how he would present a further course of action to the parents. And this seemed to break into two different directions. If he'd fortunately discovered there wasn't a basic problem with the child's heart, he would explain in detail why there wasn't a problem and invite lots of questions from the parents to make sure they understood, despite all their fears, that there wasn't a problem and that they needn't come again. Conversely, where he had discovered a problem, he wouldn't go into any great detail about what the problem was, but would say something like, well, at this stage, I'd like to bring Johnny in for a small test if you agree. And all parents agreed. So I thought I discovered how the ceremonial order worked, until I came across one or two cases which worked very differently. The doctor discovered something wrong with a child's heart, and instead of saying, at this stage, I'd like to bring Johnny in for a small test, he went into great detail about what he'd found in the heart anatomy. And he went into great detail about what might needed to be done, heart surgery, for instance, and even the chances of the child not surviving the heart surgery, expressed in percentages. And then instead of saying a small test, he said, well, we can proceed, but at this stage, I think it's important that parents let us know what they would like us to do. And of course, if you put it that way, what parent is going to say, take on responsibility of their child possibly dying on the operating theatre? And so most parents said no. To give the game away, these children, without exception, where the doctor proceeded in this way, also had Down syndrome as well as a heart problem. And the doctor, it seemed to me, was using this strategy as a way of satisfying his aim of minimizing heart surgery on Down syndrome children. We can go into, if people are particularly interested in this, the ethics of this in a minute. So I discovered something quite unexpected. A few years later, I was studying a private health clinic, and I discovered, beautifully, I was able to compare, this was no longer cardiology, it was oncology, cancer. And I'd been studying this doctor's practice in state providing medicine in what we call the National Health Service in the UK. And I got access to the work he was doing in his private clinic. So I was able to compare the ceremonial order of each setting. And some of the things were quite expected. So for instance, the private clinic was much more luxurious, looked like an upper middle class a sitting room. I also discovered some unexpected things. For instance, I discovered that patients in the private health clinic were not stuck in the chair which they initially sat down in when invited by the doctor at the National Health Clinic. When people came into the state-provided clinic, they stood by a chair and only sat down when the doctor said they should sit down. Here, they marched in to the clinic and sat themselves down. They were asserting it was their territory. They were paying for it. And indeed, they weren't stuck in that chair once they sat down. So for instance, if the doctor put up a scan, many of them would get up and stand and look at the scan over his shoulder. I never saw such movement in the state clinics. I also discovered that each consultation took 30 minutes, whatever the reason for the consultation. So even if you were just coming in for the result of a test, which in the state provided medicine would be over in 2 minutes, the consultation, people got their 30 minutes. How did they extend their time once they got the result of the test? Well, it became increasingly like a general practice consultation. They would ask questions about their coughs and colds. Or if they still had time left over, they had some of their 30 minutes, they would ask about their mother's rheumatism or something of that kind. They showed that they were going to get what they were paying for. On the other hand, you could see some, if you want to use the functionalist language, some dysfunctions of what happened in the private clinic. Clearly, it's not very functional for every patient to get the same time when they may need different amounts of time. So for instance, a new patient may need more time to be worked up than their case rather, than an existing patient. But there was no time for that in the private clinic. Also, in the private clinic, the oncologist was seeing a much wider range of cancers than he would see in the state clinic. And he wasn't such a specialist in many of these cancers. So once again, discovering the unexpected in the phenomenon. The final example, I've already spoken about HIV counseling. The final example I want to give is from research that I did in the 80s on a cleft palate clinic. Here you see a baby with a hair lip and a cleft palate. The palate is repaired in the first few months for babies because they can't feed unless the palate is repaired. But in most clinics, at least when I was studying it, decisions about cosmetic surgery on the child's lip, as you see here, is delayed until the child enters teenage years. Doctors seem to want the child, and I can understand this, to make their own decision. It's, after all, though such surgery has little risks, the child is the patient, and the child is in a better position to determine whether they should be put through those risks than, say, the child's parents. They know how their appearance is making them feel. So I got some data that I want to show you from one cosmetic clinic. And the doctor's question, which starts off this brief extract, "What do you think about your looks, Barry?" was typical of many of these consultations in a range of clinics. So at a certain point in the consultation, the doctor would turn to the child, in this case, Barry is, I think, 12 or 13, and ask the patient how they feel about their looks in the kind of wording that you have there. This is all in order to make a decision about whether the child should have surgery. So what do you get there? You've got a 3-second pause, followed by Barry saying softly, "I don't know." And the doctor says, and then laughs, "It doesn't worry you a lot." And it looks from then on, I don't have details of how this carries on, but it looks like Barry is not going to get surgery. Now, he does actually get his surgery, because later on in the consultation, Barry, where the doctor says, "So we're not going to operate, are we, Barry?" And Barry says, "Well, actually, I would like an operation." So there's some kind of misunderstanding happening here. And the misunderstanding seems to be associated with this question, asking a teenage person about how they feel about your looks. Now let's compare this to another clinic, actually in Queensland, the same year, where we see this similar question being asked. The patient this time is about 18. It's a young man of 18, who I'm called Simon. And you notice that his response is very different. He says, I really notice it, but if it could be improved, I'd like to get it done. I really worry about it. So Simon has said, I really worry about it. And the doctor puzzled me by saying, really? And Simon says, yes. And then the doctor says, not really, but really? And Simon says, but really, yes. So what does really mean here? Well, like good ethnographers, I'd been recording as soon as I went into the organization, the hospital. And so before Simon had come in, this is an extract of what the doctor is saying about him and how he's viewing the consultation to come. And I'd like to draw your attention to line 3. We're concerned about his degree of maturity. So what's going on there? The question really is being used to get a sense of whether Simon is really making this judgment appropriately about his appearance. And after Simon leaves, the doctor turns to us all. There are other physicians in the room. It says it's very difficult to assess because he's pretty sophisticated in some of his comments. And it's just the continuously sunny nature that's troubling me a little bit about the problem as to whether it should be done. I discovered something interesting and unknown here previously, that on the one hand, in order to get an operation in most clinics, you have to say you're concerned about your looks. But if you answer that question easily and straightforwardly, this leaves a further problem for the doctors, that if you're really concerned about your looks, the assumption is that you're quite disturbed. And here is Simon having no problem talking about his looks, his continuously sunny nature that's troubling me a little bit. And later on in a bit that you don't have transcribed, the doctor wonders whether Simon just wants the operation in order to get time off work, how seriously he should take his answer. What I discovered was a double bind in the consultation. To get surgery, you needed to complain about your appearance. The assumption was that those who were most troubled about their appearance would often be the least able to complain, so they wouldn't get surgery. Patients who did complain might be viewed as self-confident, hence their underlying troubles were open to doubt. Why is Simon so sunny? And they too might not get surgery. Now, I discussed this with the first doctor, and we went through the way in which my research had revealed the double bind, and also more particularly the problems that young people might have in talking about their appearance. And what I suggested, and before we got on to my suggestions, he said, I see what you're saying. Maybe I'm not the best person as a surgeon to discuss this with my child patients. Maybe I should refer them to clinical psychologists. And I said, please don't. From everything I discovered, it seems to me these people are being teased a lot in the playground. And the last thing they want to have got around is that they've been referred to somebody in the side professions. So what should I do? He said. And I said, well, there's a simple alternative. Don't ask them how they feel about their looks. Simply ask them if they'd like surgery. Don't go into that interrogation about appearance. I mean, if you think of yourself when you were in your teens and facing in a strange room an elderly man in a white coat asking you how you felt about your looks, I think most of us would have problems in answering that kind of question. So don't get involved in that kind of rhetoric. So I discovered a phenomenon, the double bind, and that was my contribution. To conclude then, there's a certain conflict here in what I'm saying between the rhetoric that you have to use to get research grants and sometimes to get access, and how you can actually have some relevance to the people you're studying. And very often what you tell audiences when you're applying for a research grant in particular, or when you're asking to be allowed to register for a PhD, is different, or should be different, from what you actually do. And I suppose the simple message I'm offering here is, if you accept anything of what I've been saying about the potential contribution of qualitative research, is don't be guilty. Don't be guilty, for instance, if there's no social problem in your research proposal, or if it's absolutely essential that you put in some social problem, give them a social problem, but then don't necessarily stick with it and discover things that are within your data that are not immediately available. Don't assume you know what the phenomenon is at the outset. Once again, I come back to the beauty of qualitative research in discovering phenomena that we wouldn't have dreamed about unless we looked at what people are doing in great detail. I guarantee if you look at what people are actually doing in great detail, and this can include those of you who are doing interview research, because I realize most qualitative researchers do interview research, look at it in great detail and you will discover things you didn't believe. Don't be stuck with the identities that you define people in terms of, but look at how they beautifully construct narratives where they move between different identities. Again, if you're using other manufactured data like focus groups, look at how the participants work between each other, constructing versions of reality. Again, the beauty of qualitative research is, unlike the side professions, it's not giving us insight into how people perceive things. Because ultimately, it seems to me, that's so limiting a way of looking at things, as if everybody has a perception inside their head before they act. Most of the time, we don't have any perception in our head, we just act. And so look at the ways, in the beautiful ways in which we construct realities within that actions in ways we would never have realized, discovering seen but unnoticed practices. And these seen but unnoted practices will be relevant to participants. So in short, to conclude, my suggestion is, only rhetorically define your research topic in terms of managerial or social problems. By contrast, by asking weird questions appropriate to qualitative research, like, how does this actually work in practice? How is the world actually put together, without assuming we know what are the features of that world? We will produce findings that turn out to be very relevant to practice. You don't know what the practical outputs of your research are going to be. But by discovering new phenomena, you can make a real contribution, as I've tried to do in all my research, but not in order to tell people what they should be doing, but as I mentioned in the context of the HIV counselors, giving them raw material where they can work out, in the light of knowledge about their unseen skills, they can work out how they can more appropriately carry out whatever it is they're trying to do.